likely context.
Hello everyone and welcome to week 8. Our focus for this week is the sharing and critique phase of the design cycle. Our inspiration comes from Quinn Dombrowski and sets the tone for this week's discussion because critique is essentially about taking a moment to reflect on your work and thinking about where you have been and establishing where you want to go next. A quick point of review here is at this stage of the course you should have gone through the process of planning your design projects, curating resources, creating assets to be used in your artifacts, putting together the composition of your artifacts, and sharing that with people. This leads us to the next phase of the design cycle, which is the sharing and critique phase. As we'll discuss, this phase is about getting feedback on your work to identify areas that may need revision. Some questions that will guide us as we discuss this stage of the design cycle are: what is critique? Why is critique important in the design process? What is the difference between positive and negative critique? And how should critique influence the next iteration of the design cycle? The first question to help guide us in this phase of the design cycle is: what is critique? Critique is an essential component of the design process that basically involves getting feedback from others on your work. It's important to note that this is more than just asking your friends what they think about your work. There's more detail about this in the example for this week, where you can see Bob and Jane and their epic fail on critique. However, some important things to reiterate are that firstly, critique should be something that you do early and often in your work. For example, you should not wait to collect feedback until you are completely finished. Instead, you should be collecting feedback continuously as you progress through the different stages of design. Don't be afraid to show people your work that may not be considered polished or finished. It's perfectly fine to show sketches and drafts, particularly when you want to get feedback on concepts of the work rather than on the implementation. The second thing is that critique should always have a purpose. When you're seeking feedback from another person, it's completely appropriate to ask them to look at something specific in your design. For example, you might ask somebody to look specifically at your use of line and shape and ignore the use of colors, because perhaps you have not yet set your color palette. The third thing to keep in mind is that critique is best achieved when it's done in small groups. Generally speaking, this can be between 4 to 6 people. What this allows for is for people to take turns in providing feedback for each other. This also helps to meet one of the principles of critique, which is to collect feedback from multiple sources, and you can do it all with the same small group. Critique should also be relatively quick. This is not a laborious process, anywhere between 10 to 20 minutes. And again, the focus here is on feedback, not on discussion. So essentially, the designer has to pretty much just listen. The individual providing the feedback should have an opportunity to review the work in advance, if appropriate, unless the designer is looking for critique on the immediate response. The other thing is that the person providing the critique should also be able to speak to their overall experience in looking at the visual design. Again, the point of emphasis here is that the designer is to listen, not discuss or defend. The final thing to keep in mind is that you should also have a specific format for your critique. This is flexible and will be dependent on the medium of the artifact that is being presented, but in general it can include a discussion of what's working in the design, what's not working in the design, and what can be improved in the design. Elements that aren't working are elements that could qualify for being removed, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Another beneficial element of critique is that it is important when you're doing a critique is to document. Write things down. Keep track of the feedback that people are providing you. This is useful so that the designer can take the critique back with them as they start to reconsider some of the revisions that they have to make to the artifact. It will also be beneficial for you as you track your learning in your portfolio. And essentially, what we're doing here is becoming transparent in your process so that you can maximize your learning and the effectiveness of feedback. Now, you're encouraged to review an example in this week's video of what critique looks like, but I do want to talk a little bit about why critique is important in the design process. What you can see here is a person who's buried in their work. Now, the concept of critique is not new, but it helps with just this type of scenario. It's very common when we're working on an artifact to get lost in it. Dozens of hours of sweat and tears will do that. In some cases, we might even become personally attached to our work. In these cases, we need to take a step back and reflect on what we have done and where we would like to go next. In this regard, critique is important because it provides a fresh perspective on our designs. Don't get buried in your work. Ask people for feedback so that it can help you to understand where you are and where you want to go. While it's important to be passionate about your work, it's also important to keep in mind that you're not the only person who's going to be viewing the artifact. This process, the process of critique, provides the opportunity for you to share your work with others before it's completely finished. When done properly for the individual designer, it helps the designers to avoid mistakes. Quite often when we're looking at the same thing for extended periods of time, we can lose sight of the fine details, which can lead to errors that somebody else can catch quite easily. The other thing is that this increases the quality of the work, the overall quality of the work, which is due in part to the fact that sharing your work with your peers, as well as with others who understand design, allows them to make refinements that may not be possible if you're working alone. Critique also helps you to evaluate whether or not your intended message is coming across, and helps you to understand how other people are experiencing your work. This is important because, after all, the primary purpose of visual design is to create a meaningful experience for the viewer. If their interpretation of the piece is different than what is intended, then you may need to look at ways of revising your design to realign with your design goals. Finally, critique can also lead to the identification of hidden gems, things that may or may not be working that you were never aware of. Again, this is a result of the fresh perspective you get when you're sharing your work with others. It's important to note here that the more often you do critique of your work, the easier it will get. After a while, giving and receiving critique will feel natural because, well, essentially it is. It's a natural process of the way that we learn. We always seek feedback. Critique is also important when working on a team project. Now, it has all of the benefits that you will get for individual work, but there are some additional advantages that can apply. The first thing when you're working in a team is that it provides an opportunity for everyone to get together and identify where they are in the process. This can also help to realign the project with the original design goals. In this phase, the question of, are we doing what we wanted to be doing, often comes up, and depending on the answer, either calls that revisions need to be made or a design modification needs to happen. You may also want to take a look at changing your design goals. It also facilitates the development of visual continuity, which we have discussed in previous weeks. Where this is important is because it allows the individuals in the team to make sure they're not working in silos. I've been in very few interesting design meetings where one person working on the typography assets will start having a conversation with a person working on the illustration assets, and they'll both realize that they're using different color palettes. So having an opportunity to do a critique in a team atmosphere provides that opportunity for discussion. And in this case, they're talking about what color palette should we be using. This also allows you to reestablish the continuity of design to make sure that everybody's on the same page. Finally, a team critique provides the opportunity for discussions about the design problems that individuals may be having and potential solution. Remember, the purpose of working in a team is to be able to go to others when you need help or you're stuck on something. Critiques are the perfect place for getting support. So now that we've established some reasons for why critique is important in your work, we can look at the difference between good and bad critique. Essentially, what we mean here is what is the difference between a good critique and a bad critique. Again, for a specific example of what this looks like, you can check out our Understanding Design Critique video. And as you'll see in the case of Jane and Bob, the first critique, while complimentary, doesn't really add any value to the work. The key point here is that the terms positive and negative critique are somewhat misleading. Essentially, what makes a critique good or bad is not what a person says about the work. What I mean by this is just because someone says that the work is awesome doesn't mean that it's a good critique. And just because somebody says that an artifact looks ugly doesn't make that a bad critique. What makes a critique either good or bad is whether or not the critique is useful. The primary purpose of a critique to be to identify what you're trying to do next in the design process. For example, are there revisions that need to be made? Does the design go along with the design goals? Is the design ready for sharing and publication? Usually this takes a couple of critiques to sort through all of these different things. But again, the main point here is that a negative critique lacks any value in terms of being useful for identifying the next steps, whereas a good critique is useful because it tells you what you need to be doing next. One thing that I want to note here about critiques is that awesome is a bad word when doing critique. Awesome is not awesome. It's a vague word. Unfortunately, it's used way too much, and it's almost as if we've lost the vocabulary to articulate why something really appeals to us. If you find that when you're providing critique you use the word awesome more than once, I would strongly recommend that you start over. The next question that I'd like to give some attention to is how should critique influence the next iteration of the design cycle, which is the revision stage. Essentially, what I'm looking at here is how do we distinguish between elements that need to be improved and elements that need to be removed from our design. This is a difficult question. Often there are elements of a design that just need to be tweaked a little bit in order to add value to the overall work. This can include changing the color, the layout, or re-establishing the point of focus in the work. What's important to note here is that any adjustments that are made must be following the design elements that we've already discussed. You're not adding anything here, and all elements should be informed by these design principles. Consequently, you should be able to articulate why you're making the adjustment. For example, you may say that I'm changing the color of this leaf because I want to use contrast or emphasis to highlight this point of focus in the design work. Now, sometimes things need to be taken out entirely. This is challenging, particularly when you've spent so much time building creative assets. However, what's important to keep in mind is, does the element interfere with the intended message? You may really like that picture of your cat, or that great selfie that you took, because after all, this is about you. But if those pieces don't help to communicate the intended message, and if they actually interfere with what you're trying to say, then they may need to be taken out entirely. Again, the reason for this is that you need to think about how you are saying something, and is the design elements that you've used interfering with what you're trying to say. You can see a big difference between the first image and the current image on the screen. In this image, the message, which is just message, is definitely clear. Previous image, I was just looking at your cat. Now, when receiving feedback, it can be often challenging to know what to improve and what to remove, as I said. So you may find that different people have different opinions about what should be improved or removed and vice versa. Now, different opinions, as you can see the individuals here having, this is not a bad thing. This is one of the primary reasons why you get feedback from more than one individual. Just because one person says something isn't working doesn't mean that it's not working. It could just be that person's interpretation or their opinion. However, if you find that several individuals have identified the same element as being something that's not working, then what you have is a reoccurring feedback. So what you need to do is look for themes or reoccurring pieces of feedback and then compare them to the design goals that you have. In this case, you have an emphasis of color. So two people say they love the color, one person says they hate it, which is great, which means the color is good. But what if you want people to hate the color? I'm not sure why, but what if that's your goal? In this case, you haven't achieved it because people are loving the color. So you might want to consider changing that. The final point that I want to make regarding critique is that you should never take it personally. Remember, the goal of critique is help you to improve in your work. If the visual design piece is intended to communicate a piece of information and it's not being effective in doing so, it needs to be revised. Recall that design, like learning and creativity, is a process, and the more mistakes you make, the better it's going to be. Okay? Design works, when you do design work, it's a great opportunity for you to develop and to screw up. And as I've pointed out here, fail often to succeed early. This is another reason why you should be seeking critique early and often. Now, as we move forward in the sharing phase of the design cycle, I have a couple of things that I want you to keep in mind and explore. Again, you should be actively exploring these things, not just reading them in the context of this video and thinking, wow, that's interesting. No. Try and find the answers to these questions. The first thing is, what process are you going to use to share your work and collect critique from your peers? You should identify the processes you're going to use to collect feedback. Are you going to have a face-to-face critique? Would it be possible to do a video chat? Or are you going to publish your work via social media and encourage people to give you feedback in that way? Whatever your process is, it should be specific and it should be meaningful to the objectives of your critique, again, which are things that you establish. You should also give consideration for a timeline for your critique. Larger artifacts such as videos or multimedia presentations may require more time than a single artifact such as an illustration or a photograph. The second thing to keep in mind is, what are your goals for your critique? These are things you should define prior to seeking feedback from others. As noted, critique really works when you have a focus or a purpose, as opposed to just doing a free-flowing, what do you think about this? Okay? This is important because it helps to inform the next stage of the design process. Keep in mind, however, that if somebody provides feedback that you may or may not have wanted, so for example, if you wanted them to just look at color, but they started to comment on the format or layout or use of white space in your design, that doesn't mean you should necessarily disregard their feedback. Just that it may not have been your focus, but perhaps something that you can take into consideration. The next thing that I want you to take a look at and explore really actively is, what resources do you have available for critique? This can be both human resources and technological resources. So are you going to collect critique from your peers, your family, your friends, or as I mentioned, posting to a website? Are you going to use the online forum that's been provided to you in the Edmodo community? Or would you rather use a discussion forum of your own creation? The thing is, regardless of what your format is, you need to give consideration to how and when you're going to get feedback from others. So as you move through this stage of the design cycle, we also need to keep in mind, how are you going to conduct self-assessments of your work? Now, whether you complete a self-assessment prior to getting feedback from others or after is actually entirely up to you. However, it's important for you to establish your own perception of your work in addition to the perception that other people might have. You may be the designer, but that doesn't mean that you don't have anything important to say. This can be very useful when receiving conflicting feedback from people when they have different opinions about different things, such as the color scheme. So maybe you had 3 or 4 people say they didn't like the color scheme and 2 or 3 people say that they did. Well, you get to be the voice that decides what the result is going to be. Now, as we move forward, if you have any questions, as usual, please feel free to email me at the email that's on the screen, or better yet, post your question to the Edmodo community where your peers and facilitators can respond.
Thanks for watching the Week 8 Context.